Bam, 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 ba-na-na-na, na-na-na-na. Hey, Jude. How good was that scene in Ted Lasso where they're like sitting outside the pub singing Hey Jude? That was just such a perfect scene. And if you have not seen Ted Lasso, you need to go watch it. I've watched it like four times through and will probably keep watching it over and over again for the rest of my life. Like to me, this is the perfect show. I swear to God, it actually helped me through my trauma and my healing journey because like you would just turn it on at night and it would give you the perfect laugh. Like it was just so funny. It was just such a great show. And if you haven't seen it, it's on Apple TV. You have to watch it. You will become obsessed. It will help you deal with anything that you're going through. Like it is such a great outlet. Well, with that being said, welcome back to What They Don't Say. Today we have on such an amazing guest. She's so cool. Her name is Tracy Detomasi, and she is doing work within cutting edge technological revolution of solutions for sexual assault prevention. And it is super incredible. So she's going to dive into the work that she's doing now, as well as kind of a background to the work that she was doing before this, which was really focused on teen sex offenders and asking those questions of, why do perpetrators do what they do? Why do they rape? Why do they assault? Why do they have these abusive tendencies? And kind of getting to the root cause of the problem. This conversation with Tracy is going to be a two-part episode, with this first part really just diving into the perpetrator side of things and getting to the root cause of the problem, but really focusing on the question of why is it important that as survivors we start humanizing perpetrators? So let's get right into it. We sometimes hear this phrase, it's a man's problem, but in reality, to be like more holistic, inclusive, right? It's a perpetrator problem. And can you talk about this and the work that you've done on the perpetrator side to prevent sexual assault?
Yeah, so I started my career as a social worker, as a master's level social worker, working with adolescents who had sexually offended. And so I did a lot of therapy with them, and that was really kind of how I entered this work, which is a really unique perspective. And it's always really been the foundation of the work that I do because I saw what a lot of other victim advocates don't see, as I saw the stories from the perpetrator's standpoint first. And it was always their fault because every part of what they did in that sexual assault cycle was calculated in some level, sometimes consciously, sometimes not consciously. But if you broke that down of how they got their victim to comply, even when it was not physically violent, it was all really intentional to get their needs met, and they knew how to do that. And they picked their victims in very specific ways. And again, these were teens, so they weren't mature, they weren't very savvy, they weren't super intellectual, but they still had this instinctual way of how they did that. And it really has shaped everything to know that it's the perpetrators who are in control. So even when you feel like, oh, I drank too much, perpetrators knew that.
Mm.
I didn't, I was wearing headphones when I went for a run. Perpetrators know that. They're tracking all of that. And the perpetrators know most likely who's going to tell, who's not going to tell. Obviously, I'm speaking in generalities, but they're calculating that all along the way. They're calculating what can they get away with? What are people going to believe? What are they not going to believe? And that's not always a conscious thought at all, but they know that they're going to get away with it. And we have created this issue where we don't know who perpetrators are. We all think that we can identify who a perpetrator is, and we cannot.
No,
We
right.
absolutely cannot. And it's because the media has shaped that for us too. Of they're going to be this creepy guy out from behind the bushes in the parking garage, and we don't think they're going to be the really charming person that we kind of have a crush on.
That your mom
And that's
loves.
typically that your mom loves. Like
Yeah.
that's typically who the perpetrator is. They're charming. They are the nice person. They are the nice guy. And a lot of times with perpetrators, I'll end up saying he because a majority of perpetrators are men, not all. Women definitely can perpetrate as well, but a majority of perpetrators are men. So I will get into that pronoun, just so you know. But I think the other thing that I really learned about why it's a perpetrator problem as well is that there's a spectrum of perpetrators. In my work, I could see it. And we want to put perpetrators into one category of these really evil, terrible, awful people. And it is really a spectrum. And some perpetrators, you give them a little bit of education and they will stop immediately. And other perpetrators are never going to stop. And
Mm.
we really need to think about that. And, when I was a therapist for adolescent sex offenders, the question I always got is, why would you want to help offenders? And my answer was always because all of them were serial perpetrators from a young
Nice.
age. All of them were serial perpetrators. All of my clients had at least 5 to 15 victims, and they probably only got caught for one. And if you could and recidivism was really low with treatment. And so if you could stop them, that's the ultimate prevention. That means that there were going to be no more victims. Where right now, prevention a lot of times in sexual assault is how do we keep ourselves safe? And that's not prevention. And so by working with perpetrators and making it a perpetrator problem and focusing on the perpetrator, that's how we're going to end sexual abuse. Because we as women and victims, if we could have solved this for ourselves, we would have done so years ago. But we can't because we haven't focused on why are they offending and how do we get them to stop offending? And that is the real big power in it being a perpetrator problem
Mm-hmm.
when we
Can
talk
I
about it as a victim's problem.
can I like kind of ask when you have been, like in these sessions with these adolescent sex offenders and there's obviously so much that happens in a person's life, but a lot of why we are the way we are is really because of like what happened in our childhood. And I'm just wondering if there was like a few patterns that you really saw in like all of these kids and like what they went through.
100% of them had been abused physically or
Wow.
sexually, all of them that I worked with.
Hmm.
Now, I will say, there's a saying of hurt people, which is true, but not all hurt people hurt people.
Right.
And so just because there are way more people who have been victimized and are survivors that never go on to harm another person. But if you look at a group of offenders and you look at a common denominator of them, it is that they were perpetrated. And that is part of how, especially with adolescents, that is how they are coping with their trauma. It's not an excuse, it's an explanation, and it is an
Hmm.
indicator of how to stop that perpetration from moving forward if you can understand where it comes from. But all of them had been physically or sexually abused as children, or neglected. Yeah, and it's been a long time. I mean, it's been about 20 years since I've done that work, but I'm sure that probably still rings true.
Do you think that we should humanize perpetrators more often? Because, like, when I think about rapists as a whole, I just think like monsters. But so, should we take a step back as a culture and a society and try to humanize what perpetrators are doing and who they
I
are?
know this is going to be controversial, but yes. And it's because the only reason I say yes is because I think it helps victims and I
Mm.
think it helps survivors because for two reasons. One, it helps survivors be believed. There's a cognitive distortion thing that happens of like, if you hear that this perpetrator has done harm, but this perpetrator as a really nice guy and really charming and funny, and I want to be around them. Well, you're going to have a hard time believing that victim. You're going to have a hard
Mm.
time believing that survivor. And so there's a cognitive distortions that happen. And so it's a psychological phenomenon that we all do. And so we can't hold that person's a perpetrator and a good person at the same time. And so if we can humanize that perpetrator to say, you can be a good person and be an offender. Because really what it comes down to is you can do good things and bad things at the same time. And we forget about that. And so until we really start to understand that the most charming people and that think people that do good work, priests, pastors, coaches,
Mm.
doctors, Larry Nassar was one of the nicest human beings that those athletes came across because their coaches were really abusive
Mm.
physically and emotionally. Larry Nassar was the guy that gave him candy
It was
and
a
gave him
safe
a
space.
break. And he was a safe space. And then he did this, and then they were confused. And so they were confused because the image that we have of perpetrators is that they are these really awful, evil human beings. Like if you look at pictures that we use of Harvey Weinstein now versus then, Bill Cosby now versus then. It's very different. And so we've now, Harvey Weinstein is a villain, Cosby is a villain, which also discredits why survivors didn't tell. Why survivors disclosed and reported and were not believed, because they were really nice men. They were really great people. They had money, they had clout. People wanted to be around them, and they didn't want to hurt their chances of fame or whatever, of being around these really great people. So it was easier to discredit and step away and disown the victim. And you can see that, yes, those are like famous cases, but you can probably see that in colleges, where if you're in a sorority and a fraternity member assaults you, you got to think about, is your sorority sisters going to turn against you? Are the fraternities going to turn against you? Are you all of a sudden going to be the sorority that nobody wants to invite to the party because you're nags, because you're snitches, because you're whatever? But if you can say that, yes, it's easy to let that perpetrator into the frat house because you were duped by them.
Right.
Because perpetrators are not only harming victims, it's a whole web that they have created, that they've used, that they have groomed other people to support what they do and support who they are. And they're very, very good at it.
I mean, it's like that's the case in so many cases that we've seen. And like, with like the Stanford Brock Turner case, like he was this super successful swimmer who was going to go to the Olympics, and that's all people focused on. Like no one was like, all the news articles that came out, no one was focusing on the fact that like he was up for rape. Like people were just talking about like, oh my gosh, like he has such a bright future. Like how could this girl take away his future? And it's like, well, he took away her future and
Exactly.
her fucking life. Like, are you kidding me? And I think that's like the thing is that, you know, as survivors, it can be really scary to come forward and say what happened. And like that happened to me. Like I was like didn't want to come forward and say what happened to me because he was such a nice guy and he was a friend of the family. And like, what if the family, like my family didn't believe me or whatever? And that's the case for so many people. And then when someone like does come forward and give an allegation, like the perpetrator, they don't think twice before trying to ruin the survivor's life.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't care about her or what she's going through or her life. Like they will say anything they need to say to destroy her life. Yet survivors are out here like, oh, like I don't want to say anything. I don't want to be discredited. Like whatever. And then it just like turns so like the tables turn so fast the second that they do say something. And I don't know, it's
Mm-hmm.
just it's ironic.
And absolutely, and humanizing doesn't mean no accountability.
Yeah.
Humanizing actually leads to accountability. And so, people are sometimes surprised when I've worked with offenders, and I do have empathy for many offenders. But part of my empathy means you have to be accountable for your behavior, because you will continue to offend until you accept accountability. It's not the same as regret. It is not the same as remorse. People want offenders to have remorse. And at least 20 years ago, there was no correlation between remorse and recidivism. You could have remorse and it doesn't mean you were going to reoffend. But accountability and accepting accountability was part of not reoffending. And so humanizing allows for that accountability. And it might not mean, accountability doesn't have to mean jail time. It could, it absolutely could, but there's a lot of other ways to hold somebody accountable that doesn't necessarily include jail time, that can be really, really helpful for survivors.
So basically, by humanizing perpetrators, we're going to bridge this gap between what we think they are and reality. And
Exactly.
in turn, that's going to lead to more accountability from the perpetrator perspective, which can also lead to a lower recidivism rate. I'm sorry, I don't
Recidivism.
recidivism rate.
Recidivism. Say
Yes.
that 5 times fast.
So when we last met, you had talked about how women are often, and people in general are often given, but especially women are often given this sort of list of things that they're not supposed to do, or these sort of safety lists, whether that's before college or in high school. And it's things such as cover your drink, make sure your dress isn't too short, be aware of your surroundings, don't walk alone at night. And you mentioned that these lists can really be detrimental, and it can sort of turn from this list of quote unquote ways to stay safe, and it can flip flop into a ways to blame yourself. So, could you talk about how these lists can be really detrimental?
Yeah, again, it goes back to what I said earlier about prevention and what really is prevention. And so long, a lot of the prevention standards have been secondary prevention. And what that means is, how do you keep yourself safe? But that's not actually preventing sexual assault. That is limiting your individual risk of assault. It's not preventing assault, because it still assumes that you're going to be assaulted. Taking a defense course, like a self-defense course, it still assumes you're going to be assaulted. It just is saying that you're going to prevent that the assault is completed. And some of these lists, what happens is we tell people, cover your drink, don't walk alone at night, women don't travel. And again, a lot of these lists are geared towards women and LGBTQ and non-binary folks. They're meant to be a form of control. Are they needed? Certainly. Should you do a lot of these things? Will they reduce your risk? Yes. But it is limiting your risk, because that perpetrator is going to find somebody else to assault. The assault's still going to occur. It's just not going to be with you. And so as a field, we really need to talk about what is prevention and what is going to, again, look at the perpetrator, what's going to get that perpetrator to stop. And then the other part that these lists are really harmful is that if you think about all the ways we victim blame, and we say, somebody says, I was sexually assaulted at a party. Well, the first question is, did you drink too much?
Yeah.
Why did you go to that party? That party house is known for raping people. Why did you go? Well, you were around that guy. Did you use the buddy system? Did anybody know? Did you have your cell phone charged? Why didn't you say anything? And so you can look at the first level of victim blaming that we do, and there are always things on that list. And so, like, I, who have been in this field for almost 25 years, think about it of, those things are more detrimental to hear to survivors sometimes than the assault itself, of the response that you get after you've told somebody that you're assaulted. And so it's like you automatically blame yourself. I was assaulted at a party. I was really drunk. Oh, I knew I shouldn't have gotten that drunk. It must have been my fault. Everybody told me not to get that drunk. My parents told me don't drink too much. My parents told me not to go out with strangers. Like, whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden, you're questioning yourself. Well, the perpetrators, consciously or unconsciously, are relying on these lists to blame you, because they also use these lists as well, she drank too much. That was on her. I could do whatever I wanted. And they use these as a way to justify their offense, so they don't think it's an offense. One of the things that is discussed a lot is drinking, especially on college campuses. And so if I were to get blacked out wasted 100 times, and 99 of those times I was not raped, and one of those times I was raped, it is not me being blacked out that's the problem. Because when I get blacked out wasted, the only thing I expect to happen is a hangover. Right? A really massive hangover the next day. I don't expect to be sexually assaulted, especially if I'm around people that I know, especially if I'm around my friend's roommate, whoever. And that's a lot of the times who's doing the sexual assault, so who's committing those crimes. And so it's not the alcohol that is the problem. It's the fact that I was around a perpetrator who took advantage of me. And I say that in quotes, because taking advantage of somebody is code word for sexually assaulting them. And it's just a way we've justified as a society of, he took advantage of me, she took advantage of me, I took advantage of her. I didn't rape her, I took advantage of her though. Well, what are you taking advantage of? You were taking advantage of the part that she did not have, or he did not have consent, that he or she was not in their right mind, that they were easily manipulated. That's all coercion. That is all part of sexual assault. That is all part of grooming. And again, these safety lists really are detrimental. And again, as a person who has done this work for a long time, of course, I worry about being raped. I travel alone as a woman in other countries.
Wow.
And I'm not worried about being raped. I'm worried about how people are going to say, well, you knew better. Why didn't you do that? Oh, I did those things because I wanted to see the world.
Yeah.
And I wanted to travel, and I didn't want to take anybody with me. But why am I blamed for that? Why am I the one that would be blamed if something happened to me? Because it's not my fault. That's a risk I'm willing to take, but that's not my fault if it happens. And yet I'm still like, I change my behavior so much because I know as somebody doing this work, I will be blamed even more because I do know better.
I mean, it's just like one of those things where it's like, what are you supposed to do? Just like not like live your life. Like there's gonna be risks. The
Exactly.
second you could, I don't know, trip in your backyard and like cut your head open. Like there's risks anywhere. And it's like we
Anywhere.
can't just like not live our lives because of this thought of like, oh, well, something bad could happen to me. And then like I'm gonna like be blamed for it because somehow I was like doing something wrong. And like I really I really like to listen. This is like kind of fucked up, but I really like to listen to kind of like adventure travel podcasts. And some of them are like about women who have been traveling alone to like other countries and like are missing and are found like brutally like raped and murdered, and it's like so fucked up. But then like there's these like commentary behind it of like, well, why was she traveling by herself? Like why did she go to that region? And it's like, how is that how is that fair? Like are these women just not supposed to, like are we just not supposed to go to any other countries and like experience life and other cultures? Like it's kind of this like weird thing, but it's the same thing with like going to a party. Like as a college student, are you just not supposed to have fun or ever drink or go to parties or like experience
Or
any
live
of
in
the
fear.
things?
I don't
Like,
want to have to live in
yeah.
fear. I don't want to have to
Right.
live my life calculated and in fear all the time. And that's not fair because I used to do trainings for coaches and athletes in college, and I did them for the military and stuff. And one of the activities that I would do is I would get 10 women and 10 men to volunteer to come on stage. And then I would have four people holding signs, and it would say, always, sometimes, rarely, never. And I would read these lists, these safety lists, and I would say, go to the sign that best describes your behavior on this statement. So I park under a light when I go to a parking lot. And all of the women would pretty much be towards the always or sometimes or always or often side, and all the men would be to the never. And one of the things that was really as women, we all knew that, right? And
Mhm.
as the men, they were astounded. Every time I did this, they were flabbergasted. And I would say, why? And they're like, we didn't know that that many women did it every time. Sure, we knew they did it sometimes, but every time you leave the house and you're walking down the street, you got your keys in your hand,
Yep.
like ready to stab somebody. Yes, every time I'm thinking about that every time I walk down the street, anytime I do anything, I'm thinking about my drink. I'm thinking about when I run, when I could do something, and they didn't have to. And it was always just so eye-opening that they don't have to follow these lists. Not to say that things won't happen to men, but a lot of times these lists don't go to a party with people you don't know. But then how many times do you know the person you go to the party with and they were the person
Right.
that assaulted you?
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
The lists are protecting from stranger danger, which is like a very small fraction of sexual assaults.
I mean, you might not know the answer to this, but this is more of just a brainstorming thought. Why is it always on the victim? Is it because we would prefer to think it doesn't happen? Is it
Because the perpetrators are the ones in power. So if you look
interesting?
at the formation of time and culture, and this is why most men are perpetrators because they hold more societal power in the world and in our country. And so they have justified the laws. Our rape laws are very terrible. Up until I think it was the 90s, in order for rape to be considered rape, you had to fight and scream and say no. There are still judges and lawyers that were practicing at that time that still believe that that's the way that rape is. There are still juries that still believe that that's what it was because we haven't done enough education and training. And so the people in power are the ones who are assaulters or who are rapists most of the time. And they control all of that. They control the messaging. Harvey Weinstein controlled the media. He controlled the movies that we were watching. He controlled all of that. And so when they have control of the messaging and the media and what is good and what is bad and what is justifiable, they get to control all of that. And then it was never safe for victims to report. It was never safe
Mhm.
for victims to speak up because, you know, Harvey Weinstein silenced so many victims and threatened them and
Right.
hurt them and hurt them psychologically and hurt their careers and probably hurt them physically as well, beyond the rape. And all of these high profile people did.
I think that's like what is really tough to come to terms to is that a lot of our laws and like even just like the foundation of like our justice system and like literally every system in America has been built on, you know, misogynistic views and patriarchal views and racist views because like they have just been like built on this foundation that was created, you know, like in the 1800s or whatever. And that's a large feat, right? Like that's like really scary to look at because then it's like, well, we need to like break it all down and like look at like the foundation for why things are the way they are. And then that feels like really overwhelming, but it's just like true. Like all of these systems are like built off of oppressing certain people and certain groups of people. And that's so shitty to think about, but it's the same thing for sexual assault. It's the same thing for all these laws that are here and like hopefully yeah, they do get better and we are seeing states put in place better laws, but it's one of those things that's going to take a lot of time. It
Yeah,
also
there's been a lot of changes since I've done this work, but there's a lot of things that have stayed the same. And I think it's
yeah.
really understanding history, you know, of like
Mhm.
what you both are going to stand on my shoulders, and I'm standing on the shoulders of women and victims and survivors that came before me. And if you don't look at where the progress has been, it feels really isolating and really lonely, but we have made a lot of progress. Have we made enough? Absolutely not. But there are conversations that are had now that never happened
Yeah.
when I was in college, that you couldn't have, that we didn't even have the words for. Like gaslighting wasn't something that anybody knew about
Right.
then. You know, coercion wasn't a word that people use. Grooming wasn't a word that people use. And I think that there's a lot more education that has happened, and education is necessary. And the victims have had to do the ones to educate. And that's kind of going back to your question, Shannon, of why is it on the victims? And it's we've gotten loud enough, the victims and survivors have gotten loud enough, and the victim advocates and everything, that people are having to listen and to make changes. But people don't want to change,
No.
especially people who have benefited from these systems, even if they aren't offenders. If they benefited from these systems, which are typically men, typically white men, they've benefited from these systems, so there's not a reason to change.
There was the recent article that came out in the New York Times that Lauren, you had told me about it, and it's all about perpetrators in the outdoor climbing industry.
Mhm.
And I was reading the comments on the New York Times article, and the amount of men that are just like, oh, boo hoo. Like, if you're going to go outside, you need to expect these sort of things to happen. And it's wild to me that we're having all these
Why would I
conversations.
expect to get sexually assaulted if I go
Right,
outside?
right, exactly. I can't comprehend, as we keep getting louder, we're trying to get silenced by these outside individuals just over and over. They're coming at us and we keep rising. But even though we're rising, I do feel like a lot of the recognition goes to these people who are outsiders who are shitting all over us. And so you're right, it can feel a little bit isolating. And I guess maybe I'm looking at it from a smaller lens. And I think I need to go back and read some of the ways that the laws used to be and where they are now.
Yeah, I think that can be really powerful. And I will tell you, I was 15 to 18 years into my career when Me Too happened, and it was huge. Just because of generational age differences between me and the two of you, you probably don't fully understand the impact of that because you've really only known adult life with that. And
Yeah.
it changed the conversation overnight. And I remember looking at my Facebook, I'm like, what is this Me Too thing? And everybody kept tagging me and stuff. And I was like, yeah, me too. Like, of course I've been sexually harassed. Like, I'm like a woman working,
Right.
like walking through the world. Like and I was watching like my friends say it, and I'm like, yeah, I know all of your stories because you've told me all these stories because I've listened to, I mean, I have like people that I haven't seen since college or high school, and they've told me what's happened to them because they see what I post on Facebook because I'm an advocate and I, post about my work. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I know all of these stories. I know it's this big. People don't know it's this big.
Mhm.
And the conversations started to shift in ways where before I had to convince people that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women experience sexual assault, 1 in 15 men experience sexual assault, 1 in 6 men experience sexual assault by the time they were 18. All of a sudden, I didn't have to convince people of the numbers, but
Mhm.
very quickly it was, well, not all men, not all this thing, but now false reporting and all this stuff. Like
Yeah.
the arguments then against it was just like, okay, well, it doesn't exist, isn't an option anymore.
Right.
So let's just
We'll
change
go to
our
the,
argument.
we'll go to the next best
Yeah.
But
thing.
right. So now your generation is going to fight a different level of arguments than I am.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But what you don't see is that there is a different argument, and that is progress.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
slow. It is way too slow, but there is progress.
And
Yeah.
that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, and I think to like Shannon, like what you were saying about like the comments you were reading on this like New York Times article, like as we kind of experience this journey of advocacy and like making changes and like fighting for our truths, it's going to like reach into different industries. And like I think that's what's happening in like the outdoor industry right now is that this stuff was rarely ever talked about. Like there was a few like outside magazine articles about sexual assault in like the outdoor industry as a whole. Like there was like the Colorado Sun came out with an article that talked about how like literally like in the outdoors, like the biggest risk for women is men. Like it is
Hmm.
not getting lost, falling off a cliff, like
It's
getting eaten
not
by a
bears.
bear. It's
Not
not a
bears.
bear. And it's literally it's men. And this is like the first time it's like really been out on like a huge media platform. And so now people in like the outdoor industry are gonna say a bunch of fucked up shit. Like that guy said, like, oh, there's always gonna be risk for women when they go out into the outdoors. Yeah, well, I shouldn't be on a fucking hike and have to worry about getting raped. Thank you very much. Like,
By the guy that's taking you on the hike. That's the other
Right.
crazy thing. Like that is beyond me.
yeah.
Anger.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of weird. Like it's good that people are like making those comments because these people are feeling like threatened because we're breaking into their space.
Yeah,
Like we're breaking into a new industry and
absolutely.
like people like women are finally having a platform to say what's been happening to them like on top of fucking Mount Everest. Even though these comments might be negative, it's like kind of like a positive thing because now people are like, oh
If I'm
shit.
not getting negative comments,
Yeah,
then we're not talking to the right people.
Right.
Like we're in our
exactly.
bubble, we're in an echo chamber, and we need to get out of that. And I think
Yeah.
because, with victim advocacy, you don't want those comments, and those comments are super triggering and everything, and so you just don't want to deal with it. And it's safer to remain inside the bubble. But if we're going to do work, we have to go to the offenders. And that means we have to go to the people online who feel entitled to say their opinions. And even they're not like that, you get the really crazy ones and you're like,
Mhm.
oh, wow, that is really out there. But then you get the like well-meaning ones,
Yeah.
I've heard stories from people of heads of departments where, most of the heads of departments at a college were men and there's like, 1 or 2 women and they're like, wow, this sexual assault thing, it's like sexual assault's becoming almost criminal. Well-meaning comment. And you're like, almost criminal?
Oh, wow.
Sexual assault is a crime. It is a
Yeah.
crime. And the fact that you, department head of a major university, are not seeing it as a crime is problematic, and that's like one tiny little story. And that is what I'm more concerned about of these like little things that infiltrate our culture. Because I think a lot of people can see the like real crazy ones, but the man versus bear has been fascinating to watch.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. This was so
Just
wild.
absolutely fascinating because again, it's not what's coming out of it is really, really profound because it's not about the bear. It's about what happens after the bear. You can
Yeah.
get attacked by a bear, you can get attacked by a man. Probably more so a man in the woods,
Oh yeah,
especially with like the
definitely.
outdoor stuff. But
Yeah.
let's say it's equal, or let's say it's even, you're more likely to get attacked by a bear. What happens after you're attacked? People believe you, they don't believe the
Mhm.
bear.
Right.
You're not
And
asked what you
that
were
is what's so
wearing.
much more, yeah. And that goes back to the safety list. That goes back to everything else, like it just changes all of that. And it just, again, full circle to those safety lists. And those things are more detrimental, can be more detrimental to survivors than the assault itself. Sexual assaults wouldn't result in as much post-traumatic stress disorder if there was support, correct and healthy support when the survivor comes forward. It's still going to be traumatic. It is still going to be awful, but that long-term effect is going to be so much less if they are believed and they are supported and they find justice immediately.
It's so vital that that aftermath is handled in a safe and correct way.
When I've been a therapist and I've talked to survivors, most of the sessions are about the people who didn't believe them. It's so much less about the perpetrator. And when it is about the perpetrator, it was the guilt that they felt for putting themselves in the situation. And then how everybody confirmed that guilt.
Yeah.
And it's undoing all of that, of years of that stuff. Than it is about the assault. Of course, and I'm not trying to minimize how traumatic assaults can be at all, because obviously they're really, really awful. But if we can get to the point of understanding trauma and understanding and changing these systems and changing the approach to that, the impact of that assault is going to be so much less detrimental.
Okay, well, we hope you guys enjoyed this part 1 of our conversation with Tracy. If you guys liked what you heard, don't worry. Tracy will be back next week for a part 2 where we are going to dive into more of her work with Callisto and how Callisto is just going to have such a huge statistical impact on survivors on college campuses. We also talk about college campus pushback and administrative problems within college campuses and how they do their best to try to hide rapes and hide that from the general public, as well as do some more myth busting, as we love to do on this podcast.
Rather than just telling you about what next week's episode has in store, here's a sneak peek preview.
90% of sexual assaults on college campuses are committed by serial perpetrators who on average offend 6 times while in college. So if we can identify that survivor or that perpetrator after 2 offenses, after offending 2 people versus 6, we're going to reduce college sexual assault by 59%.
So stay tuned for that, and we'll catch you all on the flip side. Cheers.